Good evening, everyone. This week's parsha is Parshas Shlach, and I'd like to dedicate this shir in memory of my mother, Mrs. Shalamas Rabinowitz, Shalamas Bas Rabbi Yaakov Eliezer. In this week's parsha, we have two sets of spies. The parsha begins with the spies that the Jewish people sent to spy the land of Israel. And we know how the story goes that they came back with a negative report about the land of Israel, caused Jewish people to lose their faith and trust in Hashem, that Hashem would help them conquer the land of Israel. And because of that, Hashem decreed upon that generation that they would all die in the desert, and their children would eventually end up enter the land of Eretz Yisrael. And the pasuk reads, but according to the number of days that you spied out the land, which were 40 days, a day for a year. Shall you bear your sin? For 40 years. You shall know my anger. So Hashem says the Jewish people will remain in the desert, will be in the desert before entering the land of Israel for a total of 40 years, corresponding to the amount of days that they spied out the land. A year for a day. So here's a question. It would seem that the actual sin of the spies was their negative report about the land of Israel. That was one day. Spying is what we're supposed to do. They were supposed to go and spy the land. Why are they being punished per day of spying? Spying was not the sin. Was not the sin of the spies. It was a negative report that they gave. And the answer is that, as we see, the spies going into the land, even before they went on their mission, it's clear that there was already a bias that they had against entering the land of Israel. We find the Torah tells us in the Parsha that Moshe's disciple Yehoshua, Joshua, his original name was Hoshea. And Moshe now added the letter Yud to his name to go from Hoshea to Yehoshua. Why? Because letter Yud represents God's name. Hoshea means save. Yehoshua, God should save. And as Rashi points out, God should save. It was a prayer that Moshe gave on behalf of his disciple. God should save you from the counsel, from the plan of the other spies. So Moshe already sensed that there was something wrong on their part. Moshe already sensed that the spies were not going out with a, let's call it, with a positive attitude. Moshe had already sensed, even in the Jewish people, in the fact they wanted to send out spies, that they were having doubts, they were having questions, they were having reservations, and the spies had those same reservations. And Moshe sensed that, and therefore prayed on behalf of his student Hoshea and changed his name to Yehoshua, that he should be saved. We find that Kalev, the other spy who came back and gave her a positive report, and encouraged the Jewish people not to give up hope and to put their trust in Hashem, that Hashem will help them conquer all the mighty nations of Canaan. He kind of separated from the rest of his colleagues, went to Hebron, where in Tabaras HaMachpelah, where our patriarchs and matriarchs are buried, and to pray that he too not get caught up in their plans. So it's clear that there was some kind of bias already there against entering the land of Eretz Yisrael. If there already was that bias, then that means that when they were spying the land, they weren't spying the land in an objective way of just taking in what's going on. And then after they took everything in, they decided, no, this doesn't make sense. No, if they're already starting off with a bias against entering the land of Eretz Yisrael, then every day they spy is actually the time that they're collecting the negative information and the negative reports about the land of Israel. If they were biased about going into the land of Israel at the outset, then that means that their vision, their perception rather, was tainted. If they don't want to enter the land of Israel, if deep down they don't want to enter the land of Israel, they're not going to see the good. They're going to see the bad. And therefore, being that they were tainted in their perception of the land of Israel from the outset, Well, that means that every day that they spied was just another day of gathering more negative information to tell about the land of Israel. And therefore, although being spies was something they were sent out to do, but their spying, every day they spied, was all part of their sin. Because every day they were gathering information, being that their whole attitude was negative and the whole perception was negative. Every day was another day of gathering negative information about the land of Israel to eventually report to the Jewish people. Every day was a part of the sin. And this carries a very important lesson. A lesson that when we are biased, then it's going to taint our perception. If we already have a negative attitude, we're going to perceive things as negative. If we have a positive attitude, or at least an objective attitude, we'll be able to see things clearly. But it's important to know that when we observe and we decide and we decide about and we look at something and we make a judgment about it, it's very important to bear in mind and to be careful that there are no biases that are really lurking behind in our subconscious that is going to taint our perception of what we see. That's what happened by the spies. From the outset, they had a negative attitude, and therefore, whatever they would see would be negative. The spies saw, one of the things mentioned, Rashi brings down, that the spies, wherever they went, people were dying. And they thought that, and they took that as a sign that this is a very unhealthy place. Actually, what was happening was that Hashem was trying to keep people distracted from noticing them. And there are ways they could have perceived that. But they didn't, because the attitude already was negative to begin with. And we have to be careful of that. We have to be careful to make sure that we're not biased, that at the outset of whatever it is that we need to observe and perceive, that our biases are not tainting our perception. Those are the first spies mentioned in the parsha. Now for the next set of spies. The end of the parsha is where we have the mitzvah of tzitzis. When it comes to tzitzis, the Torah tells us, they will be for you as tzitzis, as fringes. You shall see it, in the tzitzis that you wear. You shall remember all the commandments of God. You shall do them. Meaning, when you wear a four-cornered garment with the tzitzis fringes, with the fringes hanging from the side, which are called those fringes are called the tzitzis. Those tzitzis are meant to remind us about the mitzvahs of God and His commandments. And when we are reminded of them, we will perform them. Also, you shall not sosuru after your hearts and after your eyes. And that you stray after them. So clearly, the tzitzis is going to prevent us from straying after where our hearts and eyes can take us. What is the definition? What do these words velo sasuru mean? What do they mean exactly? So Rashi tells us that actually, if you want to know what the word sasuru means, you go back to the beginning of the parsha, by the spies, where the Torah says, "Vayashuvu mitur haaretz," and they, referring to the spies, returned mitur haaretz, which means from spying out the land, from searching out the land. Therefore, says Rashi, here too, velo sasurach re'lavavcha means do not spy or do not search after your heart and your eyes. Why is that? Because Rashi tells us the heart and the eyes are the spies of the body. They act as agents for sinning. The heart and the eyes, the heart and the eyes, they're the spies for the body. They are what search out. They are the ones that search out opportunities for sin. And as Rashi then concludes, which is really citing a medrash, ha'ayin roya, the eye sees, the halev chomed, the heart covets, and it says then lev chomed. I don't have the exact quote here of Rashi, but it's the heart. I'm sorry, the eye sees, the heart covets, and the body commits the sin. That's the process. The eye sees, the heart covets, and the body commits the sin. And that's what it means that the eyes and the heart are the spies for the body to sin, because the eye sees something desirous, it's forbidden, it's desirous. The heart then desires it, and then that motivates the body to act and to perform the sin. So therefore, the Torah says, do not spy, do not search after or through your heart and your eyes, that you stray after them, because they are the agents. They are our spies. They're our personal spies. But they're our spies to bring us to sin, potentially. And it's very interesting that in this week's parsha, we have two spies. We have the spies Jewish people sent to spy out the land, and then we also have our own personal spies. And they're found in the same parsha. There's a connection between the two. And one connection is the same way the spies beginning of the parsha brought our downfall and caused the Jewish people to have to die in the desert. It was the beginning. It was the seeds for the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, that our sages tell us. So those spies who were spying in the wrong way brought our downfall. Well, when these spies are spies for us in the wrong way, they can bring our downfall. And I'd like to add in Rashi a little interpretation, where Rashi says, the eye sees, the heart covets, and the body commits to sin. There are many times that the body is not going to actually commit to sin. It may come out that you don't sin. It may kind of stop there by the eyes and the heart. You don't actually do an act of sin. Sometimes it potentially has a very strong potential to bring to some kind of act of sin. But even if at the end it doesn't result in that, at the end of the day, it affects the person as a person. When a person gets so filled with lust, it drags them down. It brings down the whole person. The person's a whole different person. It's very mundane, very lowly, feels very lowly, very mundane. It drags a person down. So what the eye sees and the heart covets has the potential to chas v'shalom bring to an actual sin, or at least have a very negative effect on the person. Now, there's an interesting question that's asked. And that is that in Rashi's comment, Rashi's words are, the eye sees, the heart covets, and the body acts. It's an understandable process. You see something desirous, that's forbidden. The heart has a strong desire, and that pushes a person to act. So according to Rashi, we have the order is eye, heart. But in the pasuk says, do not spy after your hearts and your eyes. The pasuk puts the heart before the eyes. Why? Rashi has the eyes before the heart, which seems to make sense. But the pasuk had the heart before the eyes. So there's a discrepancy here. So I heard a very interesting answer from Rabbi Moshe Bamberger of Brooklyn, New York, and the name from the Baron Schechter, the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivas Rabbeinu Chaim Berlin. And the answer is that they're both true. They're both true. And although the pasuk starts with the pasuk starts with the heart, that's because initially it's the heart that begins the process, because it's the desires of the heart that push a person to look for forbidden desires. You go looking for things because those are the things you want to see. Sure, it can happen that you see something unexpectedly, but quite often it's our heart pushing us to look for things we desire, and it's our heart that will have a strong influence on our decision whether to look at something inappropriate or not. So our heart pushes us, whether we realize it or not, to kind of keep an eye out for things that we desire to see, even if they're inappropriate to see. Or when we face the challenge of, do we look or not look? Again, it's our hearts that are pushing us to look. So the starter is really the heart, because it's the subconscious desires that we have that push us to look or to see what we want to see, what we desire to see. Once you see it, then already what's in the heart becomes magnified, becomes strengthened, becomes a raging fire. And that then pushes the body to act. So it's all one big process. The process starts with the desires, the latent desires, let's call them, in the heart. They push a person to look where he shouldn't. And once he looks, that latent desire becomes very active, very forceful, raging, and that pushes the person to act. So it's all one long process. And it's very important to be aware of this process. Very important to be aware of this process, that our desires, our call it latent desires, have such a strong influence on what we look at. Because if we're aware of what's pushing us to look at what's inappropriate to look at, if we're aware of that, they're not going to be caught off guard. Then when we walk in the street, we won't, without realizing it, be looking to see things that we shouldn't. If you're not aware of what's pushing you to look, then you just kind of are going on your way and almost naturally, automatically, without realizing it, subconsciously, waiting to see something desirous that you shouldn't see. But if you're aware of that thing that's pushing you, you're more on guard. If we're aware of this, something within us that's pushing us to observe things, to look at things that we shouldn't, then when we're on the internet, we won't choose a site assuming, oh, there won't be anything there that's inappropriate. Sometimes you get onto the internet and you just, you're there and you're kind of looking around and all of a sudden, and yes, all of a sudden things pop up on you. But you decide, oh, here's this website. Well, there probably won't be anything wrong on it, even if you've experienced otherwise, because there is a desire within you that's pushing you to do that. But if you're aware of that and you're more on guard of it, then you won't convince yourself to go somewhere on the internet that isn't appropriate to go, because you could come onto something inappropriate. Forget about going to inappropriate places itself. If we're aware of that there's something inside of us that pushes us to observe things that we shouldn't, that's very important for protecting our children. When you get, the older a person gets, or the more adult a person gets, what's pushing them are passions. For a child, it's curiosity. That's what's pushing a child to look where they shouldn't look, or to go to places there, or not to be careful to stay away from certain places. But if we're aware that this is part of the human condition, that we have things within us that are pushing us to observe things that we shouldn't, then we'll be more careful to monitor our children about how they use the computer. So being aware of the things within us that influence our spies, our biases influence the way we perceive what we see. Our desires push us to go and see, go to observe things that we shouldn't observe. When we're aware of that danger that lurks within us and pushes us in certain directions or influences our perception, when we're aware of that, then we're on guard. And if we're on guard, then we don't have, then if we're on guard, then we won't experience the same kind of tragedy that came about from the spies in the beginning of the parasha. The spies in the beginning of the parasha, because they spied in the wrong way, brought tragedy upon the Jewish people for all generations. And if we allow our spies, the heart, the eyes, to spy for us in the wrong way, that brings tragedy upon us too. Chas v'shalom, it could do that. But if we're on guard, from what's inside of us, of what it does to us, what it does to our spies, what it does to our perception, what it does to our eyes and to our hearts, if we're aware of what pushes and influences the spies within us, then we can avoid the terrible tragedies that the spies can bring. Have a wonderful Shabbos.